A single historian, after years buried in Virginia court records and old shipping ledgers, arrived at a number most people have never heard in a classroom: 60%. That's his estimate for how many black Americans today carry at least one Igbo ancestor. Not a general West African ancestor, one specific people from one specific river delta in what is now southeastern Nigeria. Almost nobody gets taught this. Not in schools, not in textbooks, not even in most family histories. What follows isn't really a story about Africa. It's a story about America and about how one people's bloodline quietly became part of the hidden architecture of an entire nation's culture. For a long time, the story of the transatlantic slave trade got told as one undifferentiated tragedy. Millions of people stripped of names, stripped of nations, stripped of anything that could ever be traced back to a specific origin. That's the version most of us grew up with, a blank space where identity used to be. But that version leaves out something real, buried inside old shipping manifests, plantation ledgers, court records, and now, inside 21st century DNA databases, sits a pattern specific enough that historians who spend their careers on this exact question no longer treat it as speculation. One ethnic group didn't simply dissolve into a vague, undifferentiated mass of African. One ethnic group left a footprint deep enough to help reshape the culture, the language, and the family trees of an entire country. That group was the Igbo people, and what happened to them, and because of them, remains one of the more undertold chapters of early American history. Here's the part that tends to surprise people. Historians studying the Bight of Biafra, the West African coastal region that includes what is now southeastern Nigeria, have put together a genuinely striking estimate. Of the roughly 1.7 million people forced out of that specific region across the entire era of the Atlantic slave trade, historian Douglas Chambers calculated that approximately 1.3 million of them were Igbo. Read that again, not a minority swept up within a larger regional group, the clear overwhelming majority. This wasn't a scattering of individuals mixed in among other ethnicities passing through the same ports. This represented a sustained generational extraction of one specific people funneled through particular ports, including Calabar and the Niger Delta, and loaded onto ships headed overwhelmingly toward one destination above nearly every other in British North America, the colony of Virginia. Beyond Virginia, specifically. Actually, that same trade pattern also made the Igbo the majority ethnic group among enslaved populations shipped into colonial Maryland. And after Virginia, historical trade patterns made Jamaica the next most common destination for enslaved people trafficked out of the Bight of Biafra, meaning this same demographic story extends well beyond just one American colony. That's exactly where this story stops being primarily about West Africa and starts being about the actual foundations of American colonial society. Virginia did not receive some random cross-section of enslaved Africans arriving from dozens of scattered origins. According to Chambers' research, published in his 2005 book on the subject, of the roughly 37,000 Africans recorded arriving in Virginia, specifically from Calabar, during the 1700s, an estimated 30,000 of them were Igbo. Other historians studying the broader picture, including David Eltis, have estimated that Bight of Biafra captives made up somewhere between 30 and 45% of everyone trafficked into Virginia overall, and that as many as 80% of those specific captives were likely Igbo. At points during the 18th century, Igbo people made up more than 30% of the entire enslaved population across the Virginia Tidewater region specifically, and research indicates Igbo people also formed the outright majority of the enslaved population in colonial Maryland. Sit with what that actually implies. When historians talk about the earliest formation of American slave society, the Chesapeake tobacco economy, the plantation culture that would eventually help define much of the antebellum South, they aren't talking about some generic, undifferentiated African import. In a very real, demographically documented sense, they're talking substantially about the forced transplantation of one specific West African people, in numbers large enough to shape an entire regional culture from the ground up. Chambers, who spent years reconstructing this history through court records and archival research, described what happened in colonial Virginia using a specific term of his own, the Igboization of early Afro-Virginian slave community and culture, a slow, forced, and largely unacknowledged process by which the emerging culture around enslaved communities took shape substantially on Igbo foundations. That's not a minor historical footnote sitting in an academic appendix. It's a meaningful piece of the actual origin story of Black American culture in one of its earliest and most consequential colonial settings. This demographic concentration didn't stay confined to the colonial era either, and its effects appear to have rippled forward across generations. After years of archival work, Chambers arrived at that broader estimate that tends to stop people in their tracks, that perhaps 60% of Black Americans today carry at least one Igbo ancestor somewhere in their family tree. in a country where the popular assumption has long been that African American ancestry represents an unrecoverable blur. Too many ships, too many ports, too many centuries of forced silence to ever meaningfully trace. One historian's careful demographic reconstruction suggests something considerably more specific, that a genuine majority of Black Americans may carry a real traceable line back to one particular West African people. It's worth being precise about what kind of claim this actually is. Chambers' 60% figure is his own scholarly estimate, built from combining documented shipping records, colonial demographic data, and historical population reconstruction, not a result pulled directly from a genetic testing company's database. It represents serious, peer-reviewed historical scholarship rather than a laboratory-confirmed statistic, and it's worth holding it with exactly that level of precision. A well-researched historian's calculated estimate, not an unsettled figure verified independently by population geneticists working from modern DNA samples. That distinction doesn't make the underlying research any less significant. It just means the honest way to describe it is as Chambers' documented historical argument rather than a flatly proven genetic fact. Cultural historians have traced real threads running from documented Igbo cultural frameworks into practices that survived among enslaved communities across the Chesapeake region, funeral customs, certain spiritual practices, and community organizational patterns among them. Some researchers have pointed to the English word okra, adapted from an Igbo language term, as one small but genuinely traceable linguistic fingerprint left behind by this specific demographic concentration. Given how densely concentrated Igbo captives were within specific plantation regions, particularly across the Virginia Tidewater, it makes sense that certain cultural elements had a real chance of persisting rather than being fully erased the way slaveholders generally intended for African cultural practices broadly. Understanding just how demographically concentrated this specific population actually was also helps explain something else documented repeatedly in colonial-era records: the specific way enslavers reacted to Igbo captives. Colonial planters wanted labor drawn from Bight of Biafra ports, partly because that trade route functioned as a relatively steady, established supply line. But plantation documents from the period also record something else, again and again: a persistent reputation among slaveholders specifically describing Igbo captives as unusually resistant to enslavement, a reputation tied to documented instances of open resistance and refusal rather than simple planter paranoia. That reputation has a specific, well-documented anchor point, a real historical event that has echoed through African American cultural memory for well over 2 centuries. In May of 1803, at Dunbar Creek on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, a group of approximately 75 Igbo captives, recently purchased at a Savannah slave market, were being transported by ship toward their intended destination on a nearby plantation. During that short voyage, the captives rose up and took control of the vessel, and 3 crew members were killed in the resulting struggle. According to historical accounts, including a contemporary letter written by a plantation overseer named Roswell King, the Igbo captives who had seized control of the ship made a choice no slaveholder's ledger could ever properly account for. Rather than submit to plantation slavery, accounts describe at least 10 of them walking into the waters of Dunbar Creek, reportedly singing and not coming back out. One version of the oral tradition specifically records the words attributed to their leader in that moment: "The water brought us here, the water will take us away," a phrase still recited today at commemorative gatherings held at the site. This wasn't simply recorded as an isolated tragedy and then forgotten. Passed down specifically through Gullah Geechee oral tradition along the Georgia and South Carolina coast, the event became known as Igbo Landing, tied closely to a broader piece of African American folklore sometimes called the myth of the Flying Africans, the belief that the souls of those who drowned didn't simply die, but symbolically flew back across the ocean to freedom, since death itself was preferable to bondage, and a soul that chooses its own ending cannot ultimately be owned by anyone else. For descendants of enslaved communities along that stretch of coast, this became a story actively protected, retold, and eventually commemorated, rather than quietly buried. In 2022, the Georgia Historical Society formally erected a historical marker at the site, specifically documenting the event and its cultural legacy among Gullah Geechee communities. That history reaches directly into contemporary popular culture too, closer than most people realize. Imagery echoing Igbo Landing appeared in Beyoncé's 2016 visual album Lemonade, specifically in the segment accompanying the song Love Drought, where a group of Black women are shown walking together into open water. Imagery that multiple critics and cultural historians have connected directly back to the 1803 event at Dunbar Creek. A specific act of mass resistance carried out by one particular West African ethnic group in 1803 is still actively shaping mainstream American culture in the 21st century, which is precisely why it counts as a living historical thread, rather than a sealed, forgotten chapter. So why isn't any of this common knowledge? Part of the answer is straightforwardly structural, and it's the same basic reason so much African American genealogical history stayed buried for as long as it did. Enslavers routinely stripped names on arrival, renamed people according to their own preference, broke apart families, and left behind almost no paper trail capable of preserving specific ethnic origin for most individual enslaved people. For most of American history, tracing a specific documented African ethnicity down to a specific living family was treated as functionally impossible, and that assumption became its own quiet, compounding form of erasure, not just of individual names, but of the broader idea that this kind of reconnection could ever realistically happen at all. That assumption has genuinely started shifting, and this is where the story picks up again in a very different direction. Commercial DNA testing has begun handing back specific, individualized answers at a scale historians spent centuries unable to match through archival work alone. Companies including 23andMe have launched dedicated African ancestry research initiatives specifically aimed at expanding the reference populations available to African American customers, adding substantially more genetic reference data from Nigeria and other West African nations so that someone testing their own DNA in Atlanta or Chicago can, for the first time, potentially see a specific country, and in some cases even a specific ethnic group connected to a fragment of their own genome. Ancestry DNA has reported tens of millions of samples now sitting in its overall database, with an enormous number of genetic matches connecting customers to each other and to reference populations worldwide. What used to be treated as a permanently unanswerable question has become, for a rapidly growing number of families, something that can arrive directly in an email inbox. But here's the genuinely important twist that doesn't always make it into the more excited coverage of this topic. The actual answers people receive tend to be messier and considerably less tidy than the marketing suggests. Some families see a confident specific Nigerian percentage appear on an initial test result, only to watch that figure shift meaningfully when the testing company updates its underlying reference panels a year or two later, sometimes reallocating what had previously read as a Nigeria-specific match into broader or differently categorized regional groupings instead. Genetic ancestry estimates aren't a fixed, permanent photograph. They function more like an ongoing negotiation between imperfect, continually updated reference databases and the genuinely messy, mixed migratory reality of real human history unfolding across centuries. Broader genome-wide studies of African American ancestry have documented individuals identifying as African American, ranging anywhere from as little as roughly 1% West African ancestry up to as much as 99%. With researchers typically reporting a median European ancestry contribution somewhere around 17 to 18%, the direct genetic legacy of centuries of forced and coerced mixing that occurred specifically under the institution of slavery. The story DNA testing actually tells here is real and genuinely meaningful, but it doesn't arrive as a single tidy headline number, and it's worth resisting the urge to flatten it into one. There's a deeper, harder truth worth stating plainly here too, rather than dressing it up. Some corners of the internet have taken this genuinely documented Igbo-American historical connection and pushed it toward a considerably different claim, that Igbo genetics somehow trace back to a lost tribe of ancient Israel, framed as though DNA evidence has proven an ancient Hebrew bloodline running directly through southeastern Nigeria and into Black America today. This belief is real, and it clearly matters deeply to many of the people who hold it, since it connects to a genuinely long-standing tradition within Igbo cultural and religious identity, including oral histories referencing claimed descent through biblical figures. But it's worth being direct and honest about where mainstream population genetics actually stands on this specific claim. It is not supported as an established scientific finding, and Nigerian historians and scholars studying this topic directly have themselves pushed back firmly against the genetic version of this specific claim, describing it plainly as unsupported by the available evidence. The real documented history here doesn't actually need that kind of embellishment layered on top of it to remain genuinely remarkable on its own terms. The real legacy isn't a mythical bloodline stretching back to the ancient Near East. It's something considerably more immediate and more directly American than that. It's the well-documented fact that one specific West African people, funneled by the tens of thousands into one specific American colony in numbers large enough to help shape that colony's emerging culture from the inside out, went on to become one of the significant, if historically underacknowledged, genetic and cultural foundations of Black America itself. It's the fact that a word for a vegetable, patterns in certain community customs, a documented historical reputation for resistance, and a 2-century-old story about souls choosing the water over bondage aren't separate, disconnected curiosities. They're pieces of the same buried historical architecture, still quietly present inside a culture that rarely got taught its own full blueprint. And the story keeps moving. Genealogists and historians continue refining these demographic estimates as more archival records get digitized and cross-referenced against slave ship manifests that once seemed permanently unreadable. Commemorative gatherings still take place at the Igbo Landing Historical Marker on St. Simon's Island, where descendants and visitors from diaspora communities including Nigeria, Haiti, and Belize continue to gather and mark ground that mainstream American history classes rarely mention at all. Documentaries and academic studies on this topic keep getting released, keep getting watched, and keep reopening both a wound and a genuine act of reclamation at the same time. Families keep opening DNA test results and discovering, sometimes for the first time in their lives, a specific name attached to a piece of themselves they had always been told simply couldn't be recovered. The genuine historical case that Igbo ancestry and Igbo cultural influence helped shape early Black American identity, particularly in colonial Virginia and Maryland, is well documented and taken seriously by historians who've spent entire careers reconstructing this specific record. The real open question now is what continues to surface as reference databases keep improving, as more descendants choose to test their own DNA, and as more archival shipping and plantation records get cross-referenced against each other. How many more of these specific documented demographic threads are still sitting quietly in old plantation ledgers and Bight of Biafra shipping records, waiting for the right historian or the right family to finally connect them,